Havening is a new psychological therapy that has the power to treat everything from work-related stress, anxiety, fears, and troubling emotional memories and more in a simple and straightforward set of steps that you can learn to do yourself. We're going to cover what it is, but first, in order to understand how it works, we need to know a little more about our brain. So let's just pause and temporarily rewind for a moment and enter the world of what's under our hood. Each of us is completely unique, with different upbringings, experiences, and exposures across our lives. We are our history, the collective result of our experiences to date. Individually, this makes up what is known as the landscape of our brain, which is literally, to get a little bit scientific, the electrical chemical state of our brain at any given time. As we grow and go through our lives, that landscape may have had good caretakers and been allowed to develop protected from harm, and has grown into a beautifully formed environment with strong, well laid out pathways leading to beautiful places, tall, resilient foliage that is able to bend and bounce back in the wind without breaking, with its own resident gardener who's been taught its worth and understands the importance of feeding the land with a ready supply of valuable nutrients so it may yield the results of its fruit and contributes and fulfilled its purpose to the greater land that it exists amongst. Alternatively, that landscape may have developed in an unprotected, polluted atmosphere, exposed to the harsh elements with pathways leading to dead ends, obstacles and hazards, leaving it weak, vulnerable and purposeless, depleted of its richness and resources and battling hard to survive against the conditions that it's exposed to. If any of us have been exposed to negative experiences, grown up in environments that have depleted us, or faced adverse situations and life events, this can alter our landscape and leave it vulnerable, setting the stage for how we respond to future events and our level of resilience or vulnerability. This already vulnerable landscape can also present itself in everyday life through unwanted behaviours and responses, such as So this landscape can become chronically changed, leaving us susceptible to these effects in our lives. But even the stronger landscapes can become temporarily disrupted by particular events that may occur to us, leaving it temporarily exposed and vulnerable, or if untreated, can become more chronically so. So if this landscape is vulnerable, and we then experience an event or a situation, this can sometimes be stored as a traumatic memory. So how does this happen? What is going on under our hood, so to speak? What happens that's different inside the brain in the creation of a traumatic memory versus how we normally would store memories? The sensory information that we're experiencing in the moment in that event comes through our neurology, through all of our senses, into what is known as the thalamus in our brain. thalamus then passes a certain amount of the information directly onto the amygdala. It is this amygdala that is responsible for detecting immediately whether we are at threat or in a non-threatening situation. If what we're perceiving to be going on is non-threatening, then we just store certain elements of this information as a normal memory. So, what's different in traumatization? Let's look at the components now. So, we have the event itself. There has to be a particular event or an experience that occurs. And as we were talking about with the amygdala before, if the amygdala perceives with the information it has available that we are at threat, and our landscape is already vulnerable, there is one other component that needs to be present in order for us to store things traumatically. And this is a perceived sense of inescapability. What we mean by this is something that is occurring as an event by which we feel as though we have no means to escape. This doesn't have to be a literal escape. There are many situations in life that we perceive that we just have no way out of, where we are stuck, helpless, out of control and at the mercy of others. Or in the moment we perceive that we can't do anything to get ourselves out of it. Of course, there are the more obvious situations where we are literally unable to escape. But whichever of these it is, if we can't find a way out or we're out of control, this is one of the contributory elements that means that we become traumatized. So we have the vulnerable landscape. We are perceiving it to be threatening. We have an event or a series of experiences collectively and a strong emotional response to it because we're being threatened. So, how does this occur within the brain? Let's revisit the amygdala where all of this occurs. All of the information is coming in through all of our senses, through the thalamus and into the amygdala, where it is carried through a series of nerves known as neurons. These neurons form a pathway from one neuron to the next, and so on. Between each neuron, there's a gap that the information has to jump across. This information is in the form of an electrical chemical pathway. In other words, it's a form of electrical waves and chemicals. At the end of each neuron, we have what is known as a presynaptic neuron. The synapse being the gap that this information has to jump across. So the information gets to the presynapse and is transported as chemicals across to what is known as the postsynaptic neuron, the neuron on the other side of the gap. It is on the surface of this postsynaptic neuron that there are receptors ready to receive these chemicals to transmit the information through down into that neuron and onwards. There is a particular type of receptor on the postsynaptic surface of the neurons in the amygdala that is responsible for this traumatic encoding. When information through this signal, including the emotion-producing stimulus from the event itself, gets to this synapse, chemicals which excite and activate a particular type of receptor are released from it, and they activate what is known as an AMPA receptor on the surface of the postsynaptic neuron. A particular protein enzyme is also released. which is called the PKM zeta-like enzyme. And this enzyme permanently binds this AMPA receptor to the surface of the neuron. In other words, locking this receptor in place. What this receptor can then enable is each time we experience a trigger, it can pass that signal straight through the receptor all the way to the emotional response. This allows a direct and extremely strong link and connected pathway to the emotional content. From this moment on, whenever something triggers it that is remotely similar to the initial event, not necessarily logically, but just perceived in that way by our unconscious mind, the pathway fires off and generates the same emotional response, the associated behaviours that come about off the back of that, and releases the stress hormones in response to this event. For example, say we were unfortunate enough to get bitten by a dog and we had a vulnerable landscape and we perceived that to be threatening to our lives, and we couldn't get out of it because the dog was coming at us and we had no way to get out of the park or wherever it occurred. The next time we see a dog or a park or even the shadow that could look like a dog or anything that reminds us of that particular initial event, the trigger gets fired off. It zips through that pathway straight to our emotional response of, say, intense fear and panic. This receptor that's responsible for transmitting this signal stays permanently anchored onto the surface of this neuron, ready to get activated whenever something signals to it. We experience a trigger to transmit this through to the emotional response. However, and this is where finally havening comes in, the havening can disrupt this pathway, permanently delinking the trigger from that response. So what is havening? Simply put, havening is using applied touch to accessible parts of our body in order to alter our brain chemistry. It is this altered chemistry that gives us a way in to be able to biologically change the way that our memories have been stored. The Rudin brothers, who created havening after years of research, have found a way to literally de-link the emotional content of a memory from the memory itself, therefore meaning that the memory is no longer traumatic. Because of the way the havening touch alters our brain chemistry, it's not just about traumatic memories. It has multiple uses, as it creates a calm state and creates chemical changes that enable its use in depression, anxiety, as well as being used over the longer term to get the amygdala, which we've spoken so much about, over time to literally stand down and stop detecting threat, which is what is going on in anxiety. It also, when used over a longer period of time, alters that landscape of our brain, starts building it up to make it stronger and more resilient, biologically changing and altering the state of our brain. Due to the state that it evokes within us through the havening touch, it can also be used extremely powerfully to do the equivalent of installing suggestions to ourselves, exploring beliefs that we have or that we want to have, as well as outcomes and goals that we have for ourselves in a very intense and compelling way. But for now, for this particular video, we are going to look at what the havening does for these events that we've been speaking so much about, and how it helps de-traumatize them and remove that emotional response. So in what is known as event havening, we initially and extremely briefly have to activate that neurology and get that AMPA receptor that we were talking about activated, ready to transmit that signal. To do that, we need to really briefly ensure that the memory of the event is recalled. Beyond that, we start going immediately into distraction techniques and start applying the sensory input as havening touch. The touch is gentle, calm movements repetitively done onto our shoulders and upper arms, our palms, or across our cheeks. Very quickly, this touch produces a form of an electrical wave which is known as the delta wave. This delta wave is the same as what we produce when we're in slow wave sleep, the deepest form of sleep that we can go in. This delta wave changes the state of our brain, and it alters the chemical and electrical balance of it. The touch and the delta wave increases our level of serotonin surging around in our system, and decreases cortisol, which decreases our stress levels. All of this leads to a very calm state. That delta wave travels through and gets to the postsynaptic neuron automatically, and as it does so, it opens up what is known as the calcium channels, a channel which lets calcium directly into the postsynaptic neuron. This calcium activates a particular protein enzyme called calcineurin. This calcineurin effectively dissolves the other enzyme that was holding this AMPA receptor active and activated, what is known as potentiated, on the surface of the postsynaptic neuron. By dissolving the enzyme that was locking this AMPA receptor in place, the AMPA receptor is allowed to internalize and therefore the signal from a particular trigger has no way to link it to the emotional content anymore. The path is permanently disrupted, meaning that if the trigger occurs, it delinks that from the emotional response. No emotional response to a memory means that it is no longer traumatic, it is just a memory. So there you have it. Havening touch can alter memories, change our landscape and make it far more resilient. So although we are always our history, we do not need to be defined by it.